The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tyler, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I am Tyler, the person who has actually read these books, and I am joined, as always, by Greg, who has not.
I have read half of one book. Huzzah, huzzah. How are you, Tyler? Oh, he was taking a sip as I did that. He was expecting me to talk a lot.
I was expecting one sip's worth of talking. I'm doing fairly well. I have an apple cider donut, hard apple cider, and that's a good way to podcast. So I'm feeling pretty good about it. What are you drinking, Greg?
I have an IPA tonight, which I know goes against what you believe in, but it is, I forget the name of it, but it was themed after like a space pirate's spaceship. And I judge all the things I drink by what's on the can. So it's delicious.
As far as I'm concerned, if we need to start with witty banter, describing what we drank and not knowing the name of either drink is as good as it gets for me. So why don't we then dive into something that I have not prepared you for at all, which is yet another ill-advised discussion of a visual artifact in a non-visual podcast, or however we want to call it, which is the chapter icon on chapter 26, which is Thom Merrilin's harp. And I want to make sure that we talk about this chapter icon today because we will be seeing a little bit less of Thom Merrilin's harp, as you might imagine from the end of chapter 26. So Greg, having had no chance to prepare for this, I'm curious just what your initial impressions are of this chapter icon, if anything comes to mind, and then we can obviously talk about kind of where it fits within the world and, you know, what it usually signifies when it shows up at the beginning of a chapter.
Sure. So again, if you share my mass market edition, we're on 414, but the opening page of chapter 26. This one actually stands out from the rest, in that I would say it's a little more abstract. It definitely, you know, evokes a harp. There's no mistaking that, but it's not as literal as the branches or some of the other symbols have been. It's got this kind of funny, kind of abstract outline, and then the harp lines in the middle. I think what comes to mind is, you know, kind of the classical lady strumming a harp type harp. So like a giant one, whereas this is clearly the type of harp a traveling minstrel or gleeman would have. So perhaps it's just my ignorance about specific types of harps. But, with the circle, it looks more like a guitar type structure than the kind of classical giant harp structure.
Yeah, and I think you highlighted something that I think is really interesting here, which is the center of the icon, where we have kind of the hole in the middle, which, like you say, is kind of an unusual shape. I don't know whether that's a style of the instrument that's typical of a particular era or region, or if, like you, I'm only familiar with one type of harp. That might just be the case. But I think it's really interesting that we see the strings of the harp continue through that circle, but in an inverted color. And so this was really interesting to me because the term that you had used when we first started looking at the chapter icons is you described them as kind of looking like woodwork or carvings. And I think this is the first place where, to me, it doesn't kind of have that feeling of being carved. That inversion of color as it goes over the whole feels like something a little bit more artsy than carved, to me at least. And that was the thing that jumped out to me about this icon. Was a lot of the icons we've been highlighting kind of the dichotomy between light and dark and how those things have been interplaying with each other. And this is just a largely light icon, right? There's some detail that's dark, the backdrop is dark, but it's not like the Dragon's Fang or anything else where we had the kind of interplay between shadow and light. So I think it's an interesting icon in comparison to the others, because for a variety of reasons it does kind of stand out. I think that's a really good call.
So overreading it, what is interesting in light of what you just said is then when I think about, okay, if you're taking a harp with this type of construction, then the part of it that creates the song would be the strings over the whole, right? So the strings get strummed or, plucked over the whole, and that creates the resonance. That would be the notes we hear. And so in that regard, it is the light in the dark in this particular icon, right? So that the song, which resonates with the other chapter we read, perhaps, the song would be a force of light in darkness. And I'm a little less suspicious of Thom as I have been in previous chapters, so that kind of fits how I'm reading him, right? Like, I'm somebody who is a humanities scholar, so I believe in the power of art and storytelling to be that kind of light in the dark of the gloominess of life, and what are we going to do except tell each other stories so we forget we're going to die. And that's kind of, again, it's overreading it, but it's nice that with that inversion here and the whole set of choices, that the actual source of the music would be light, primarily covering the darkness.
Yeah, and I think that that's really interesting in light, pun, of the fact that what I wanted to highlight, and this actually works very well as a no spoiler kind of solid dodge. While this icon has so far been used to denote chapters that have Thom Merrilin in it, it is worth noting that we do also see this chapter icon occasionally pop up for other Gleeman or for scenes that kind of focus on music or song or dancing. And I like that for two reasons. One is that I think it's always really interesting when we get something that is both a character icon and a thematic icon, because it kind of lets you play that little game of like, wait, is this a Thom chapter or not? And especially now in light of Thom having vanished halfway through the book, right? Does someone else take on this icon? Does, what's going on with this is, I think, an interesting question. But then in light of the overreading that you were doing, I also really like that we get this, this icon that's very much about like the light in the darkness of music, because we've already had one chapter that really highlighted that when we had like the big dance scene 5 or 6 chapters ago, and we were thinking about like, is this too cheery for how dark things are, or is it what they're fighting for? And so I like that kind of visual metaphor of the light and the dark in the music. I think it works really well. That's really all I had for this chapter icon. I just wanted to make sure we brought it up. I think this might be the last time it appears in this book, so making sure we cover all of our bases.
So would this, here's the question we should ask at every chapter icon, would this then be my tattoo when I have fallen so far in love with these books through our reading? I'm going to go with no on the harp. It's just not my vibe. It's a little too abstracted. And as you were speaking, I was paying attention, but I flipped back to try to see, well, what would be my tattoo so far? And I'm going to go with the one on, it was a bummer of a chapter. So chapter 23, the Wolf Brother, has a pretty badass dog on it. Wolf, excuse me. Yep. But I don't think I could pull that off, right? Like if I rolled up my shirt sleeve and that was on my bicep, people would be like, nah, I don't think so, bro.
That is one of the 4 chapter icons that is on my bicep, but continue.
There it is. And then I'm going to go back to chapter 22, also from last episode. I didn't really like a path chosen as a chapter, but it's got a very simple kind of moonlit tree, and that's a little more my speed. It's a little indistinct. Somebody'd be like, oh, again, if I'm at the beach, they'd be like, that guy really likes nature, or he stands alone in a field or something. So totally fits my New Hampshire upbringing. So I'm going with that one so far until a chapter icon displaces it.
There are multiple tree chapter icons, and you have chosen what I refer to in my head when I'm trying to distinguish them. Because remember, I don't think in images. I always refer to that tree as Sleepy Time Tree because the moon is so
Oh.
prominent behind it. So
It
that's what
it
you
it
want your
reminds
tattoo
me
of.
of and this is my dad showing, but it reminds me of Harold and the Purple Crayon, right, where he draws the
Oh yeah.
moon and follows the moon. So yeah, a classic of children's literature. But
And what
don't let
better
me talk. Yeah.
I was going to say, and what better transition could there be into chapter 25, The Traveling People, which has nothing to do with moons or crayons. So in this chapter, we pick up with Egwene, Perrin, Bella, and Elias making their way overland. And Bella and Egwene seem to still be pretty tense around the wolves. They're having trouble adapting. They travel for several days. The one big conflict that seems to happen is Egwene kind of pushes Elias to also get in on the rotation of riding the horse, and he shuts her down pretty quickly. And in doing so, it appears that's the first moment that Egwene actually notices Elias's yellow eyes, and she has a fairly strong reaction to that. They travel for a few days. One just quick note here. They mention that they travel for most of a week. A week in the Wheel of Time is 10 days, not 7. That's just a weird world building detail that might be important to know. After this, they approach a copse of trees, and they are approached by a number of mastiffs who at first scare them, but Elias settles them down, and very quickly they realize that in this clearing of trees are a group of the traveling people, or the Tuatha An. Initially, Perrin and Egwene are kind of skeptical. They've heard stories of what they call the Tinkers and how they will steal things from towns and potentially even steal children. However, eventually they're kind of drawn in through a brief kind of ceremony where they're invited to spend the night with the group. And eventually they learn about the way of the leaf, the philosophy that these traveling people follow, which I'm sure we'll spend some time talking about. And as they're discussing this, they meet in particular one young individual among the traveling people, a boy named Aram, who approaches Egwene and basically is like, hey, I'm awesome. Come have dinner with me. She does. And Perrin seems to be a little bit broken up about this. We then hear a brief story that Elias is told about how some of the traveling people encountered a number of Aiel who sent a message about the Eye of the World, which I'm sure we'll also at least briefly discuss. And then finally, we get what I think is actually a really nice and touching scene between Perrin and Egwene, where they kind of reassure each other about their worries about Matt and Perrin, or Matt and Rand and the rest of them, and whether or not they're still following behind as well. So it's an interesting happens. What did you kind of pull out of this, or what did you think about this chapter broadly?
Uh, Nice to have a further expansion. Again, I'm still thinking about this back half of the book, or the roughly as the Two Towers portion, and this felt to me like very much like the start of Two Towers, where we pick up Rohan pretty quickly, and we get some different people in the mix, and these are not horse lords or anything of that. So I liked that, and I was drawn. Anything that enriches the world, and you keep picking up different forces and hope they all keep spinning as a part of this. Then the other thing is, I was just on vacation a week ago, and one of the books I read was David Mitchell's Black Swan Green, which is set in, gosh, I'm going to be really bad at the politics of this, but I think it's 1970s Britain, and you have the travelers who are there, and I believe the preferred term is something like Romani, but in England they're pejoratively called pikeys, right? So like Brad Pitt in Snatch, like, just to jump all over the place in references. But as I understand, kind of very similar to this group, right? It seems like a pretty close analog where they are, not really homeless, but people who live in caravans and vehicles, and are generally thought kind of stereotypically to bring crime and disreputable forces to different cities and towns. And so, like in this novel I was reading, the town banded together to pass laws to ban them. But they, in the action of the novel, prove themselves to be like really good people. And I think that's kind of what was immediately present here. It's like, like the Romani in history or the Pikeys, or, we've had plenty of people like this in the United States as well. They seem like a group that is naturally distrusted and marked as other, as outsider, that we shouldn't allow them into our communities, quote unquote. And yet once they're in the mix, it's like, oh, they seem like they're for the light, and good people that were generous of spirit. And then I guess just to ground that point a little more in the mythology of the book, the idea that they lost their song and they're traveling to find their song is really compelling. I'm like, that's awesome. That's a great kind of defining characteristic for a community. So I was a fan, and I liked this as further enriching, who's around.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting to me in this section is the contrast between, like you said, in Lord of the Rings, the next place we go to Rohan, we meet all these new characters, and we start to build out the world. But in this sense, in the Wheel of Time, what we're getting is two groups that could not be any more different, right? We're getting Elias and the wolves, who are very kind of anti-society in a way, and they're very comfortable with violence directly, right? They are predators explicitly, as opposed to the traveling people, who are the opposite of that. And so to me, Robert Jordan is doing such a good job of building a world where there is strict, obvious black and white, right? There is a literal dark one. There are monsters who want to eat you, but then he's seeding so much gray into this world, right? With the white cloaks and with the Tuatha on and with Elias and all of these different factions that we could classify as good, but all different degrees and types of good. And they're going to have all different types of, ways of agreeing with each other. I feel like it both makes the world feel really lived in and kind of valid, right? People don't agree in like a good, bad kind of way in the real world. But I think it also just makes me really excited to see how, the first time I read this, I was almost excited to see how good of a world builder Robert Jordan really is, right? Can you take a world that has this many disparate ideas and make them feel cohesive? And I feel like he does a surprisingly good job of it, despite the fact that we get a lot of contrast and culture, even just in these first 300-400 pages.
Well, and I'm going to link a point about this chapter and the one we'll talk about in the second half of this episode. Both of them describe a huge amount of stuff happening, quote unquote, off screen, right? It's like all of this action continues to churn and to happen as we're focused in on the specific flight of the characters we know on this path. And so it was really remarkable in both to kind of sense like, oh, but there's a lot going on. It's and to your point, I think that's what makes it feel so authentic. Like, if you're reading a great World War II history, sure, you can read about one unit of Americans crossing France, but it's like, yeah, but all the Pacific theater, not to mention the other parts of France, not to mention, blah, on and on and on. And so I think, a good fantasy writer finds a way to balance that in some ways, because when the conflict feels too small, I think it gets unbelievable. And again, since we're making the Tolkien comparison, I think he does it too, right? That you stay kind of intimate with Frodo and Sam, but then you start to get a sense of the politics of Gondor and Rohan and that kind of deep history between those countries, states, peoples, and then while the kind of plot against Sauron is ticking in the background, and I think you're right to give Jordan credit, because it's one of those things that when done well seems like super simple, but so many fantasy books or movies do it so poorly that you pause in a tavern and get like let me tell you the tale, and then get filled in like 3,000 years of history. So this continues to find these little vignette moments where we get new pieces, and like I said last episode, sometimes I'm good about remembering those, sometimes I'm not. But as soon as something will bring this up again, it will click and I'll feel really good about myself, even if I've forgotten it in between.
Absolutely. And I think one of the things that Robert Jordan does so well in building these sorts of like worlds and cultures is that he draws from the real world just enough to make things feel realistic, but he never draws from the same well so often that it feels like he's just giving you a version of Earth, right? He takes all of these kind of cultural inputs, like you're saying, from like Romani culture, what, has, typically stereotypically been called like gypsy culture, right? Which I know
Yeah.
is not the way we're going to be referring to them broadly, right? But
Right.
when we talk about Romani culture, he takes that and then he combines it with what feels like a very Middle Eastern or Mediterranean style. And then when he's
Mm.
describing the covered wagons, they feel very kind of like English Western. And so he's taking all of these kind of modern influences, which, given the fact that this is the real world, works really well. And he kind of puts them all together and molds that clay into a culture that feels really real because it has a bunch of lived in parts, but it's still unique to us. And I think that's what works really well about the Tinkers, right? Is that he has this way of saying, okay, these bright garish colors that remind us of one thing and this style of living that reminds us of another. And then, at other points, he'll describe architecture that feels very out of place. And, in this case, there's no weapons, but often he'll have, Western armor and Eastern weapons or things like that.
Mm.
And that sort of cultural world building by pieces, I think, works really, really well in this instance in particular.
Well, and to that point, the way of the leaf felt very Eastern to me in the way it's described. I know you and I are both devotees of The Good Place, and The Good Place finale, spoiler alert, it doesn't really give away anything, has a character describing Eastern philosophy on life and uses the metaphor of a wave in the ocean and how, water becomes the wave and then it crashes on shore and it's no longer the wave, but the water remains, as a way to kind of think about our own lives. And the way that moment where they're describing the way of the leaf and how the way of the leaf is to exist and to be a part of it, but then to fall to the ground and foster the growth of other leaves, felt very Eastern, rebirth and reincarnation in a sense. The maintenance of the energy or of the life force as opposed to the individual, which I think naturally to me kind of feels more Eastern than us go let's stab everybody Westerners, as the case may be. So I think that's exactly right. And so I would say that's the Eastern point here, and it's not a weapon like you're saying, but it's a philosophy. And of there, I think I'm not somebody who is violent, but I'm also not a pacifist. So it was interesting to me in the description of the way of the leaf. I found it so wonderful to get drawn into. And yet when the characters are laughing at it essentially, or very skeptical of it as an extreme, I found myself like defensive of it in some ways, because I think it's such a valuable ideal, even if it is not an actual good thing that's happening.
Yeah, and I will say here, I am not an unbiased observer of this. I think in part because of my own interest in Taoism and Eastern religion, but also because I read these books when I was young, I more or less follow the way of the leaf. I am a pacifist. I'm not a big believer in self-defense, even though I know that's not super popular. I'm a bad way of the leaf follower. I do eat fish. I'm not a vegan like these wonderful people, but this philosophy spoke to me, I think, when I was young and as I've grown, and I really relate to it. But I've always had a really hard time with the way of the leaf in Wheel of Time land in a way that I actually don't in my own life, right? Because I live in a world that is exclusively a world of gray. And so I am very much like, look, there's no such thing as true evil in the world I live in. And so like, I'm not going to be violent because there's nothing that truly deserves it. If I was one of the traveling people, I would be totally down with being a complete pacifist until a Trolloc showed up.
Yeah.
But that's not the philosophy, right? And so there's this very interesting thing about having, in a world where there is pure black, a philosophy that doesn't believe in self-defense, right? Because that's very different from, in some way, doing it in a world where there isn't a true evil that wants to eat you, right? The second there's a real actual devil, pacifism gets a little iffier.
You're reminding me of a guy who went to my high school, lived in my hometown, and he became a vegetarian. He probably became a vegan based on what I'm about to say. And I remember his dad was talking to my dad, and I was present for this conversation. And he was explaining that his son was so against violence that he, when mosquitoes came and started like landing on him to bite him, he would just blow them away. He would blow on them until they flew off. And, again, not trying to be dismissive of a whole philosophy that people have. I was like, that is absurd, right? But so you're reminding me of that as an example, like, yeah, this is all well and good until the practicalities of a Trolloc come. And
Right.
so the idea that, a Trolloc comes to this, beautiful camp and starts burning down and stabbing people, your only choice is to run away seems false. And so I think you're right. And, I would like to believe I would not, stab somebody who tried to stab me in the subway or something. But
Right.
but it's hard to imagine a world where you could exist purely on this way, especially in a fantasy world with real dark evil. I mean, yeah. I was going to make a MAGA point, but I won't. I won't ground it in our time and place. I will just leave it at that. So, well, and I don't want to dismiss the first part of the chapter if you have much to say, but it seems like probably the conversation at the Tinker camp is the meat of this chapter. So things that stood out to me, many of which made your summary. One of them is again, and I reference this, the idea that they are seeking a song to bring paradise back. I think that's really cool. And it already seems to me like Rayan doesn't really believe it's gonna happen, right? Like they're still devoted to this, but he's like, yeah, it's probably not in a city. And it's like he's not really actively trying to do that. And the other thing that it brought to mind is, and you can correct me as the more knowledgeable on these books. Initially, we were told that Moraine was seeking stories, correct? Yeah, that she had come to Two Rivers seeking stories to learn more about the world and so on. And so that to me felt very resonant. That power in this world, whatever it may be, seems to have some connection to knowledge. And I would put song and story. I mean, what am I doing except like describing bards in Dungeons and Dragons, right? Like whichever type of bard you are has value. And that is, there's a power derived in the telling of a story or the singing of a song. And again, if we're talking about a fallen society, then that would be very powerful. Something that comes from the age of legends or from part of society that's been lost. It makes sense to me that different factions would be trying to seek out that knowledge as a means of, bringing about paradise, bringing about a golden age, ruling over the darkness, what have you.
Yeah, and I think it's so interesting to me in the context of this, thinking about just how deep time is in this discussion in this world, right? Because they explicitly say they're not just seeking a song that was lost at some point in the past. They're seeking a song that was lost in the breaking of the world, which pretty much implicitly means they have been seeking for 3,000 years. And just that is incomprehensible to me, right? That would be like a society that had been looking for the same thing since early Egypt. Like that's ridiculous. And so I'm just always in this world. It's so mesmerizing to me just how important the past is to this world, given how much time has passed since then, right? It's not that it's been lost and forgotten, it's that it's almost become more important as time has gone on.
So everything you just said, but then the additional wrinkle of, but there's a cycle. So like they do have this kind of deep abiding knowledge that it will come back around again. So yes, they are kind of quixotically seeking something 3,000 years old, but they know it's going to come back around. Like there has to be these steps that get us back to the initial reset. Again, I think I couldn't point to specific details off the top of my head, but there's this sense that we're in the last cycle, like the last spin around, which makes me think of Sir Gawain, right? There's a lot of thinking about how he's in his last cycle. So I think that's a part of this too, like is the finding of the song, the last cycle, which finally breaks the cycle. And then just cycle then as a word fits in like to storytelling and song, right? Like you have a cycle of poems or a cycle of a story. So Yeah, and I mean, I hate that we might just turn this podcast into a I think the word is hagiography of Robert Jordan. Like, we're doing like he's so great, like he's just so
Yeah.
great. Or to be less high minded, we're doing the Chris Farley show. Like, do you
Yeah.
remember that time, Robert Jordan? That was really great. So I just, but I do think it's a real credit that somebody who's new to this, somebody who's only halfway through the first book, has this kind of sense that this world is saturated both in the cycle and in the ending of the cycle, unless I'm terribly misguided.
And we'll find out if you're terribly misguided in 13 books. It'll be
Oh,
great.
excellent. Okay,
Yeah.
just around the corner.
I think that, to me, we've talked kind of about the philosophy of the Tuatha, and we've talked kind of about the ceremony and the goals of that society. So to me, the last thing I wanted to pull out from this conversation was when Rayan tells Elias the story about the Aiel warriors that were found in the desert, and kind of this message that was sent. And so I was curious what kind of piqued your spider senses a little bit in that, because obviously I am able to put the pieces together, whereas it's a puzzle missing a lot more pieces for you.
Yes. So a few, I think maybe two big things that came out of there for me. I don't want to promise a few and then only have a couple. So one that stood out is there's a very brief moment where it appears they suggest Elias has a history with the Aes Sedai that is different than how he has presented it. So it, rang a big bell to me that as I read the moment, they were implying that he had been an Aes Sedai and had walked away, kind of that type of relationship. And we knew from the last chapter that he didn't like one of the factions of the Aes Sedai. I'm already blanking.
Yeah, so we know that he killed warders, but warders they serve the Aes Sedai rather than being a faction of. But yeah.
Right. And so when there's they kind of trailed off and they recovered, and even Perrin could say like, well, they're clearly hiding something in that kind of construction there.
Yeah.
So that stood out to me as kind of a like, oh, there's more to Elias than we know. And again, makes it then interesting to think about Perrin, because he seems to have the Wolf Brother power. Could this be a manifestation of the One power? Is this a type of thing that makes you seem like a dark one or a false dark one, and you need to be, what's the word? You need to be gentled.
Yes.
Gentle. Yeah. And then the second one is there's a really rich moment. I jotted down, it was on page 411 in my book, just that you get name after name after name of the Dark One in some of his descriptions, right? And this is the passage you said we'd probably want to unpack. Leaf Blighter means to blind the eye of the world, lost one. He means to slay the great serpent, warn the people, lost one. Sight burner comes, tell them to stand ready for he who comes with the dawn. Tell them, and then she died. So this is the specific message of from there. And there's a lot there that's really interesting. I mean, Leaf Blighter stands out in the context of the way of the leaf, right? And so if the way of the leaf is pure pacifism, then this is just somebody who just burns it all, right? The napalm bomb of the way of the leaf to defoliate. And I guess I won't say more there. I mean, that was clearly a moment, and it falls into this category we've talked about before. Like, is it a prophecy? Is it a message? Kind of. But I will say, to me, that moment hit much more in the, oh wow, like we're gonna see something really cool here, than the like, yeah, you know what this is type of dream moment we've talked about previously. So I really liked that part. And I guess the only other note I have here in mind is just to note Maidens of the Spear who go seeking the Dark One. That's super rad, and also kind of sounds like Rohan, right? We had the God,
what's her
my
name?
Lord of the Rings is Eowyn.
That
is
one.
a shield maiden, specifically a shield maiden, not a maiden of the spear, but it resonated. And then just let me picture Eowyn, who I always kind of had a crush on. So it's like, okay, good. We're there.
Sounds good. That works. No, and To me, that section that you read out loud with like leaf blighter and the eye of the world and all of that, my main note about that was just how many capital letters there were at the beginning of words in that section. Like everything was
Yeah.
a proper noun, and that just made me zoom in on it a little bit. I mean, the one thing that I thought was really interesting is that we got just a little bit of this interesting dynamic between the Aiel and the traveling people, the Tuatha An, in this section, because we learn that most people are not able to cross the Aiel waste, but the Tuatha An are allowed to, along with peddlers. And they said people from Carrion used to be able to, and then they say before the tree and the war. And that's interesting world building, but not, it's kind of nonsense to us so far. But then the other thing that we learn is that the traveling people have tried to approach the Aiel before, and the Aiel more or less completely are unwilling to interact with the traveling people. They're not violent towards them. They don't stop them from traveling through their lands, which is different from a lot of other cultures, but they do not want to interact at all. And I thought that was both really interesting world building to tell us something about how these two cultures relate to one another. But I think it's also just really telling of how important it was when one of the Maidens of the Spear was willing to send a message via the Tuatha An, right? The fact that they call them lost ones and are never willing to speak to them, and then suddenly will rely on them in that last moment, I think tells us something about how important this message was.
Yes, enemy of my enemy type relationships, and certainly compelling, and a way for Jordan to just keep that pot that's on the back burner just getting closer and closer to the boiling, that when we don't even know these cultures, we don't know these characters, but it's like, no, this is weird that they would do this. This is extreme and desperate measures. I think is just a really nice way to make us be like, sit up and pay attention, for lack of a better phrase for it. So it's great.
And again, we don't need to just say only the great things that Robert Jordan does, right? But I think there's a talent for what could have been a very exposition dump, like 2 or 3 pages, and turning it into how do you build worlds and tell something about character and deliver the message at the same time. I think it's just really effectively done. Unless you had anything else to talk about in this chapter, I suggest we move on to our more plot-centric chapter rather than philosophy-centric in Whitebridge.
The only note that is unaddressed in my notebook here is just to note, I think it's actually at the very end anyway, that the wolves have taken over Perrin's dreams. So he doesn't seem to be dreaming anymore about Biazalon, but is kind of, I mean, he's going feral, it felt like, right? Not necessarily in a bad sense, but that as he continues, and there's notes at the beginning of the chapter about how he can sense where the wolves are and sense, what's going on. So it's very interesting again that it like kind of just took Elias to spark this in him. Maybe it's another old blood thing or something, but he certainly is just kind of becoming whatever it is he's meant to be with the wolves instead of that. It's then it makes me wonder, is Beazalon like testing them one at a time,
Right.
and it's like, oh, okay, this is not the one. And as we'll talk about, I'm sure in the next chapter, he seems to still be testing the other two, and there's some real question there about what they're gonna do. So
yeah, I think it's really interesting to me to see the dynamic of all of these different powers emerging, and we're just figuring out how all of them work. And then we get the fun overlap of like, well, wait, what if dreams and wolves? And like, it's just fun to see all of that play out and the interesting things that come out of it.
A weird like rock, paper, scissors. It's like, but if dreams and wolves, then wolf beats dream. And
this sounds like the rules to a game that I would make you guys play. It's like, okay, there's only 26 factions, guys. The interactions aren't that complicated. But rather than going into that much intrigue, why don't we instead head to chapter 26, Whitebridge, which is a chapter where a lot happens. We start with what I wrote down in my notes as Matt is real bad at flute. Basically, Thom is training Matt and Rand in the art of being a gleeman. They're doing it in order to try to entertain all of the people on the ship. And Thom basically starts to realize, now that we are no longer with Moraine, now that you two are no longer under the thumbs of Aes Sedai, maybe I can talk you into going somewhere else. And so Rand starts to try to get people, he tries to convince them that maybe they should continue on with the ship down south to Ilion. And in the course of that, there's basically a debate about whether or not they should be waiting for Moraine and Lan and the rest of them. And Rand is pretty blindsided when Matt basically says, no, they might be dead. We should probably go. At this point, they arrive in Whitebridge. It's a town with a really big, beautiful white bridge. That's kind of what it's got. They make their way off of the ship, but not before the captain, Bail Domon, offers them significant amounts of money to continue on to Ilion with him, and in fact refunds their passage for their trip down. Thom again tries to convince them to do so, but Rand is pretty steadfast that they need to go to Tar Valon. They make their way to an inn. They gather a little bit of information, but quickly it becomes apparent that the innkeeper has already been approached, not only about the people that they are looking for, but also for Thom and Rand and Matt themselves. And he says that he has been approached by two people. First, a few days ago, a madman who eventually left town and headed east towards Camelin. And then second, by a dark cloaked figure who we quickly realize is a Fade. The group is soon dissuaded from going south to Ilion by Gelb, the person who they got kicked off of a ship, making a bad name for them. And as they attempt to escape town, they are confronted by a Fade. Thom briefly, actually, jump back a second. Thom briefly tells them about his backstory and his nephew Owen. Then they encounter a Fade, and Thom, muttering something about Owen, tackles the Fade and seemingly is engaged in a lost battle with it as Rand and Matt flee. So this is our first big kind of event or plot twist or whatever we want to call it. How did it land for you, and how did this chapter kind of set up the moment, either effectively or ineffectively, from your perspective?
So I think the best place to start is I, at the very bottom of my page full of notes, wrote favorite so far. And I think I would say, a couple episodes now we were saying that roller coaster was ticking to the top. And this felt like pure downhill adrenaline on that roller coaster.
Yeah.
And I want to be clear that I don't just mean at the end of the chapter when we get some action, but the way it's like starting to pick up pieces all the way through, and every choice we've made along the way is going to come in and make a difference here. Really was exciting, and it was really fun to watch. I think my favorite moment might have been when the innkeeper just like changed on a dime. It was like, actually, you need to finish your wine and go. I thought that was really compelling and exciting, and so I really left this kind of purely positive and really excited about where this is headed. And it's one of those where you immediately check the heading on the next chapter, like, are we staying with them? No, we're not. The first word of the next chapter is Perrin. So and we shouldn't, right? I mean, that's only going to make you keep reading and make you excited. Normal people who are reading this book straight through would keep reading to get to the next chapter. I might have to wait like 3 weeks, who knows? And I mean that positively. So I guess, I'm going to just try to take some of this chronologically, because I could just gush about a lot of different places. But the first thing I will say is I thought it was really cool and something not in Tolkien to have a city like this. Actually, the comparison it felt like to me was, and this is such a random comparison, but in the Guardians of the Galaxy movie, but also some of the comics, you get Nowhere, which is this head of an Eternal, I think, that is in space being mined. And it's just like this giant mystery. And you're like, what? They're just in the head of something, like mining brains. And that's what this felt like to me, that you have this city that is sprung up around the Whitebridge, and it's made of a material that can't be hurt. It's not wood. It's not stone. And yet nobody kind of tries to explain it, and it doesn't sound like they actually live necessarily on it. They've just built societies or cities on either end of this bridge, and they have kind of a cultural point. So I think that was really fun to picture. That was one of the few moments so far where I was like, oh, I can't wait to see that if the
Yeah.
show gets us there and shows us what that looks like. um yeah, well, and then I'll leave you with this, and then I'll pass the baton. And then I immediately went to, again, this question of, okay, where could this be from, like our society, or is this just? I mean, it's called Whitebridge, so it's a white material, but it's like, is this a plastic of some kind? Is this
Right.
a concrete, or they say it's not stone or wood, I think specifically, but it's like there are a lot of other materials we have, and could that fit into
Right.
to be a remnant of something? Because of its placement and all that, I couldn't think of a literal, like it's not the Tower Bridge, or it's not
Right.
like the St. Louis Arch or something like that. But like thinking of, well, what could that be from because so much of this is like medieval style Europe kind of
Yeah.
that I'm picturing. It's like, well, what could that be from the modern age that might fit back into that? Um, yeah, man, I just like rambled a bunch, but then I also want to say, Rolling Stones, You're Not in Whitebridge Anymore came to mind as well, right?
I,
Which is a lyric of a Rolling Stones song.
I'm not a rock guy. If there was a hip hop White Bridge song, I'd be much more likely to know what that was. I actually really like that idea of kind of a city growing up around something ancient like this.
Mm.
And I actually, for a couple of years, I was teaching in central Pennsylvania, and one of the great and frustrating things about teaching at a small school in the middle of nowhere is that if a class needs to get taught, you just kind of teach it. So I ended up teaching urban economics for a couple of semesters. And this just fits, right? Cities have this weird characteristic of once they're there, they pretty much always grow, but they've got to get to some, like critical mass before they really catch on. And I think that this idea of a mythical unbreakable bridge as that critical mass for a small town, it fits, it makes sense. That's how worlds work, and I think it's really effective here. The other thing that I would say with Whitebridge is I just think it's really interesting to think about, and it's something you mentioned too. How do you build a city around something that you don't completely understand? Right? It's this weird thing of being reliant on a bridge that you can't manipulate and can't change, and for all you know has a 3001 year expiration date. And just there's something, this is something I've actually loved about living in Boston as opposed to living in other parts of the country, right? Is sometimes I turn around the corner and unexpectedly I'm in front of like a 270-year-old church or something, right? And I can't imagine living somewhere like when we were walking around like Rome or Paris and we would see 2,000-year-old ruins. It just felt different. And I feel like this is just another order of magnitude of feeling different. And it's a really effective vignette of a city that Jordan has managed to sketch just in kind of a couple of objects that works really well for me. Sorry, now I'm just talking about how much I like this city design. That's maybe not what we need.
Well, but it's right, because as sitting here in Boston, when we look to Europe, it's like they think we're just so young and it's just
Yeah.
foolish. Like, my wife and I just bought a new house and it's from the 1890s, and that's like a new house in a lot of parts of Britain.
Yeah.
And yet the way Boston is situated, then when the West Coast looks to us, like a really old house on the West Coast is like 1950s,
Right.
perhaps. So I do think it does feel that same way. Like I too love sitting around and walking around the city rather, and you stumble upon a courtyard that has a stone in it that's like, oh, here's Ben Franklin's parents or what have you, and you're like, oh
Right.
my god, like we are in history. This is history in some ways. So yeah, I mean, I think we've covered that, but just to note that if all that is true, like if I were walking around Boston and I saw like a cool monument or building and I got to say like that's from the Age of Legends, that would
Yep.
be really amazing to get to. So that's a fun level of that. It also resonates to me with, like, again, seeking the song, seeking the story, like that's the Age of Legends. Like,
Yeah.
it all resonates and has a shared valence, if you will.
Well, and now that I'm actually thinking about this, sorry, just one more note on this sort of world building piece is this actually feels to me like something, and it's an example you gave, but it feels like something that's much more out of sci-fi than traditional fantasy, right? I feel like there's that, The Expanse does this to some degree. We see this in a lot of Isaac Asimov stories and some of the Wells stories where our technology or what we are doing in some way comes from something outside of us, right? And that's a very kind of science fiction trope of we found the ancient alien civilization and now we will use it to whatever, right? This is how Mass Effect works, or 2001, or I can just keep listing things, but it's really unique as far as I'm aware in fantasy. And so I think it's a cool trick to bring that in to a genre that doesn't see it as often.
Yeah, and Lord of the Rings has a lot of ruins that they walk past
Right.
that kind of filled a similar role, but it's clearly fallen. Whereas this is no, it was so great it lasted,
Yeah.
if you will. And I don't think Game of Thrones really does that.
Yeah.
There are a couple kind of things on the other continent, as I recall, that have a deeper sense of time than what's in Westeros. Right now we could be watching House of Dragons, so I feel like maybe we're missing something obvious because we're recording during the airing time of that.
Fair enough.
So man, so that was like a ton on like the third paragraph of the chapter.
That's how this should work. Let's not get to the actual plot.
Yeah.
If you don't mind jumping forward just a little bit, I would love to talk about the news from the innkeeper before the innkeeper turns on a dime and we get that, kind of terrifying sequence of him revealing who's after them. But we get some big news, right? We learn that Logain, the false dragon, has been captured. We learn that there is a call for the great hunt for the horn going on in Ilion. Lots of things are happening in the world. And I was curious what within there, it's an interesting little bit of exposition in the middle of a very plot heavy chapter. So I'm curious how that landed, or if it kind of got lost in the crazy around it.
As I suggested last chapter, I think this was really well done in that it is just in the background. Like this has happened. Yeah. Actually the comparison that comes to mind for that is I always laugh about how Lion Witch in the Wardrobe has like, I think it's literally 2 paragraphs that's like, and then there was a great battle and the lion won. And then they did the adaptation and it's like, that's, it was right after Lord of the Rings and they were trying to, and it was like half the movie was like that battle. Cause if you're doing that cinematically, you'd want to show it. So I think I naturally thought of that, like, his storytelling, like, if you're trying to do this on the cheap, that's fantastic, right? You have a barkeep tell you what happened instead of having to CG the giant battle. And as a choice, it tells me that this story is much more concerned with the interpersonal and what happens to people within these systems versus the systems versus the factions and the forces. Yeah. And I like that. Whereas a movie, I might want to see the giant battle because that's super cool on an IMAX screen. I like in reading a novel, I'm like, yeah, because that gets boring so fast. And even the best writers to me, like I start reading about a sword fight or a fist fight, and I just kind of naturally skip to the end to be like, okay, who's laying on the ground? Are they dead or are they, wounded or incapacitated? Right. So and again, we saw this way back in Two Rivers that they skipped the battle and showed us that. So now, that being said, this, to steal your phrase from a moment ago, it's a magnitude different. Like the idea that, now we have this false dragon that seemed like such a great threat is just like incapacitated and it's over and they're marching armies in. To me, that was like, oh, okay. So that would be the equivalent in Game of Thrones of like, yeah, we took care of the White Walkers. Like, don't worry about that level anymore. We're just focused on who's going to sit on the throne now. And I that naturally makes me suspect that that's not true. Like, or or if this was truly, if Logain was a false dragon, then there's a real dragon that they haven't identified yet. But so Logain isn't actually been captured, or is actually not the real threat, I think, is what I took away from that piece of it. Again, you tipped off that the next book is called The Great Hunt, so I was like this is just the next book. Like, don't worry about that yet. Like, we'll go to Ilion next book, or we'll worry about that then. I'm talking too much, so I will just say the one other thing I pulled out of that, and this is maybe my ignorance, but they note that there is a queen in Tar Valon, and I didn't recall that there was a queen
I
previous to
I
this.
think there is a queen in Camelin,
Oh,
and
okay.
there is the Amerlin seat in Tarvalon.
Okay. And
But
the
so
queen has an M name that's kind of like,
Mordays.
yeah, I was like, it's close enough to Moraine that I was confused, but
Yeah,
okay. But is that the first mention of a queen? And
I
what
believe it
should we think
is.
about this?
Yeah, and actually, if you're willing to flip to the front of your book and take a look at the map, we know that Logain was captured near Lugard in Murindy, so that's kind of like middle bottom of the map, and they're
Okay,
headed.
so I will say I'm willing to flip to my map, but the problem is it's not in my front of my book,
Oh,
right? Like, every time I want to look at the map, I get so annoyed that it's not the inset. Like, I'm sure it
Okay.
is in the hardcover. I
Yeah.
have to go find, like, after the prologues, and
Oh,
after, yeah, it's
geez.
a pain in the neck. So anyway, yes. So okay, hit me again now that I actually have it open. So I
Yes.
see.
So the Lugard is where the battle took place, or nearby in Murindy. So that's bottom
Okay,
middle of the map.
so south of Whitebridge.
Correct. Kind of
Yes.
southeast of Whitebridge. And then they are headed towards Tarvalon, which is northeast, kind of north of, if you see Carrion or Erangil, go north from there.
Yep.
And so actually Camelin, where the queen is smack dab in the middle. It's actually a very nice stopping point. And that happens to be where our characters are headed as well at the moment, right? They're in Whitebridge, headed towards Camelin, and we can see there's a mark in the middle for Four Kings, at least on the version of the map that I have. So that
Yeah.
it's kind of converging storyline. So even though, as you're saying, this is all happening off screen, everything is at least pointed in the same direction at this point.
Really interesting to me in the way you just described that is, it does seem like if I plot from Whitebridge to Camelin and then up to Tar Valon and Lugard, all that, there's an interesting gap in the roads, right? That the road from Whitebridge goes to Four Kings, and then you have to go actually south on a road that heads towards Lugard before doubling back to Camelin, which I assume has to do with either a ferry or a bridge over
Yeah,
the river.
it looks like there's a river there. There is, like, in my edition of the book, there's like a much thinner path. I don't know whether it's like less well traveled or something, but there is like a path over the river, but it's definitely not as well defined on my map as the other two. So yeah, there's an interesting something geographically going on there.
Well, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because I think mentally, without looking at the map, I'd kind of assumed this was in the north, because it seems like a lot of the action is happening in the north. So the fact that this is happening south of here, and that there are, again, these giant armies potentially down there,
Yeah.
much closer. Again, the way they describe Two Rivers is like it's in the middle of nowhere. It's like, no, this is all happening pretty close compared to how far we're going to Tar Valon. So,
Well, and that's what's so interesting to me about the Two Rivers. We talked about this a little bit. It's, the furthest place from the bright center of the galaxy or whatever, but it is also in the middle of the map, right? The only reason it's so isolated is because of like bog river, mountain river. It's not because it's actually far from the action. It's pretty central to a lot of the things that we've been reading about. They just feel far away because of those geographical barriers. And I find the geography of this section of the book to be really interesting. If you wanted to, you could kind of carefully trace like where in the grass are Perrin and Egwene versus where along the road are Matt and Rand. And it's an interesting kind of travel sequence in that there's a lot of moving parts all headed towards the same place, but they can't get there by the same route. And it's pretty well balanced, but it is a little, I think, confusing sometimes if you're not staring at the map while you're reading through these sections. It's easy to not realize everyone's going the same direction because you get so many easts and souths and norths, and it's a little tricky sometimes.
Well, and to continue us through the chapter, we also have the presence of Ilion and the Great Hunt.
Yeah.
And that is where the ship captain offered to like, we're headed that way. And to look at that map and see how far south that is. That's basically like, let's get as far away from the trouble, which is
Yeah.
the spirit of Thom wanting to do that. So Thom in those moments really intrigued me. I think I'd previously called him sus, but like the way it's really interesting to me that he's like, I want to get as far away as possible, but that is a second order desire to, I want to stay with these kids, right?
Yeah.
That he tries to convince them to go, but to him, there's no question that he would just go, which seems like the
Yeah.
most natural choice in the world. And so the fact that he wants to stay with them really, again, I joke that he's sus, but I don't necessarily think he's sinister. I think my most kind of generous read of his motivations is simply that he wants the story, right? Like
Yeah.
if he's a gleeman and his trade is telling stories and going to an inn and making coin, that seems natural that like he can tell there's a really good story unfolding here, so he would want to collect that. But I think if I remember correctly, they even kind of call him out on this. They're like, "Then just go, dude. like,
Right.
like we don't need you." And he finds a way, as always, to kind of talk his way around that to always make it, "I want to stay with you, even if that puts me in harm's way."
Well, and I think it's really interesting. This is both the chapter where we see Thom's kind of callous attitude and, I'm in this for myself way of thinking about things come up against the first real open moment we've gotten from Thom, period, right? We basically know nothing about this human other than gray hair, gleeman, loves gold and telling stories. And now we know he has a nephew named Owen who has, he phrased it, you could say Aes Sedai killed him, which is an odd phrasing in and of itself. But given that we're thinking about kind of how does Thom fit in, is he sinister? Is he suspicious? Is he just sus without the suspicious? I think that's a really interesting nugget that we get in this chapter. So what was your take on that story? Because it does go against kind of the way we viewed Thom pretty much the entire book up to this point.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Owen is supposed to be an uncle, not a nephew, in my pure Star Wars brain.
Fair. Okay.
Yeah, so since this is not a video podcast, Tyler just started looking at his book to see if he made a mistake, I think.
I was like, wait, what? That does
What?
not.
No. It did not stand out as prominently to me as you are describing it now, but that also could be a function of it. It's the last few chapters, the few pages of the chapter when the screaming toddler starts to win over I need to just read these 30 pages, leave me alone. So it might be just poor reading skills. But I do think that combined with what happens at the very end of the chapter certainly makes him out to be more heroic. And if he hasn't been sinister, he's just been poorly defined. So to add some definition to that, and I think I noted at the opening of this episode and in your summary of this chapter, you kept it very open, right? That Thom seemingly dies, and as a good fantasy reader, I was like, yeah, he's not dead. Like before you said that, like when I finished the chapter, it's like, unless you see the body, right? Unless you have clear evidence that they're dead. But I will say that ending where it was like, I think, let me describe it this way. I think all this way I've been looking for him to actually commit. And it was only in that last moment that he actually committed. Like, no, I'm loyal to these boys. This is who I want to be. I'm going to sacrifice myself if it means that in order to get their freedom. And so I liked that moment, and in good fashion, make a character really compelling and then make it seem like you lose them, I think is a fantasy trope.
Well, and it's not just a fantasy trope, it's just like a straight up trope. I think one thing that I have this is a fun game that me and Steph play when we watch television, is like anytime that like tertiary character gets a stand-up monologue, I immediately am like, they're gonna die in the next episode. And it's usually correct, right? And I think that's why I am focusing so much on the Owen monologue, is because it feels like that moment where the, you know, character on Glee who finally gets a solo and then gets hit by a bus or something. I don't know, I don't watch Glee, but like that's what this feels like with Thom, right? He finally gets his solo moment in the sun. He gets close up and then he gets to go out as a hero, but
Yeah.
he goes out pretty quickly.
I like your television reference as something that's been off the air 10, 15 years, but I will double down on that and say it was always the rule on Lost. You get to the episode of the flashback for a character and you're like, well, that could be the end this time around, because that's all we need to know about that character, and they've served their purpose. So also in this chapter, I mean, I think two other stray observations. The first I have is this someone crazy. I feel like this has to be somebody we know, somebody who has gone crazy since we saw them. My top contenders would be Tam, or and you'll have to fill in the name, the Egwene's father, the owner of the inn.
Oh,
look how he struggles. That means it's not this person.
Elvir.
Yeah. But it seems like to me the answer has to be somebody from Two Rivers. I think Two Rivers has probably continued to suffer, and this person has come to be like, oh my God, like we need to get them back just to solve this problem. And again, that's partially because like Nynaeve is off the board and a few other potential people we've met along the way. But I feel pretty certain that we know who this is, because it doesn't feel like that person was sinister. Whereas then the Dark Rider came, the other one, as the innkeeper says. And I think mainly what I took from that is just that, like, you know, whereas some simple narratives would drop people as we left a place, this is a narrative that is not going to forget the people we met along the way, and their story is going to continue even if we don't see it until they come back into the fold of this story. But the way the innkeeper was so unsettled, I mean, I think they were primarily unsettled by the dark one, but also the crazy one was certainly a part of that, and generally just gave this feeling of like, get out of my inn. And I think before that we kind of got in the sense he was maybe a cheap innkeeper, like a little manipulative, but then it was like, oh no, this is like he just is afraid at this point.
Well, and I think it's a moment that I've seen in film a lot, right? Where like they cut out the score and you get the dramatic moment of the character just completely turning on a dime, and you get that like character actor who only has 2 minutes of screen time gets the wonderful moment where their face changes, right? It's hard. It's a hard moment to pull off on the page, I think. But this chapter, I will say, it does a really good job of ratcheting up the tension with every kind of notch of things that goes wrong for them. Because this kind of is that, like, it's almost like it reminds me of a lot of bottle episodes on TV, right? Where things start very happy and end absolutely insane. And you kind of wonder how you got there in 20 pages.
Well, and then the last sequence just made me feel so much like a video game. I'm not a huge gamer, but I play a lot of Assassin's Creed over the years, and it felt like an Assassin's Creed mission where you're like, I got to blend in, and then as soon as it goes a little bit wrong, everything goes wrong. And like a beautiful Assassin's Creed mission for me is like you can absolutely do it with stealth, and if you nail it, then you did this beautiful thing and you got like 3 extra achievements or trophies. But if it goes just a tiny bit wrong, then you lose somebody. You end up,
you just kill everyone.
Exactly. And then it's like, oh, I'm just going to run through this gate with 50 bodies on the ground behind me and an unlimited combo chain. So a couple of things, these are stray observations in the context of our conversation so far. I thought it was kind of a nice, easy fix that the boat captain handed back the coins, and then we find out kind of late in the chapter that he didn't hand back the right coins.
Not the same coins.
He was fair and he gave them the right value, but he didn't actually return the right coins, which just feels like trouble to me, because now Moraine is going to have a harder time, or will assume they just continued on down the river, perhaps,
Right.
or will have a hard time locating them on the Camelin Road. And it was really interesting to me that we had the coin that seems like an object of hope, and the dagger, which is an object of darkness. And so it seems that there is a way in which Matt is being deeply affected, and there's a couple of references where he's like, oh, you're acting out of character.
Yeah.
So I think this object is taking over him and having a larger effect, making him more aggressive and dark. But also that it is also triggering something that's following them, right? I think there's that sense that the forces of that city are following them as well. Yeah, let me pause there.
Yeah, I think just one thing that brings up to me too is, as we're thinking about kind of these different forces of darkness, right? We've got the dagger, we've got this madman, we've got what apparently is a fade. And I think it's really interesting that these searches don't seem to be coordinated, right? It doesn't appear as if this, crazy person is, in some way working with the dark friends. It almost feels as if there's like multiple groups looking for them now. And I think that is it does the same thing this chapter does, right? It just ratchets up the tension one extra level. It's no longer we know the dark friends are after us, it's the dark friends and someone. And I think that unknown is a fun thing to play around with. It works really well.
Yeah, I don't have a specific video game example, but there are those types of video games where you just like, if you run through a level belligerently, you suddenly turn around at the end and there are like 5 factions like having chased you, and you're like, oh, right, I was supposed to actually think about this. The designers made it so you can't just go on a mad dash through there. Maybe Skyrim was like that at times. Like if you ran through a town stabbing people, like you'd have a whole bunch of problems.
I was just about to say I hated Skyrim because often in open world games my strategy is just sprint past scary things rather than taking the long way around, and in Skyrim that just really resulted in like 6 scary things landing on me at the same time.
Oh shoot, now I want to play Skyrim. I think that's most of what I have. I have a stray observation from early in the chapter, which is just the way there's a voice of doubt in Rand's head. Felt to me like it was presented like it was just him being unsure of himself, but I actually think there's something more there. I think the dreams are affecting him, or there's, he's been scratched by thorns and stuff. It felt like there's actually a dark presence within him that is starting to have an effect. That felt that way to me.
Well, and I would also just quickly tie that into, we now have 2 examples of Rand laughing uncontrollably, first with the white cloaks and then on the rigging of the ship. So it definitely fits into a pattern of other things going on.
Yeah. And I mean, that to me also brings up Harry Potter questions, right? That, gosh, I think we can spoil the end of Harry Potter, that Harry is a secret Horcrux. There's a piece of Voldemort living in Harry. It feels like there's a piece of the Dark One alive and well in Rand.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I will just note, I was excited by the idea of the Great Hunt. It was compelling that all the characters were excited, and how Thom wanted to go hear the stories there and be ready to create a new cycle of myth around the new Great Hunt.
Yeah.
The innkeeper was like, well, if you told Great Hunt stories, everybody would pay big money and spend a lot in my tavern right now. So it is really fun that in a myth, they are actively making new myths. That's just a fun kind of doubling of the storytelling. I think that's all I have for this chapter.
Well, and then I think I'll leave us with 2 quick thoughts kind of related to that. One is, I think there's a very fun moment where the innkeeper says, or maybe it's Bail Domon, someone says, like, you should go to Ilion. They're starting this competition to tell the Great Hunt for the Great Hunt for the Horn. The best storyteller gets 100 gold crowns. And Tom's reaction is almost like roll his eyes and be like, yeah, that sounds like a pretty cool prize. Like, he is just super not impressed by it. But the last thing, I think actually this is how I want to end this episode, other than our usual outro and what chapters are coming next and all of you, is as soon as Thom hears that they are calling for a new actual Great Hunt for the Horn, he launches into just a super quick stanza from the presentation, the story he has told of the great hunt for the horn. And he says, in the last lorn fight against the fall of long night, the mountains stand guard and the death shall be ward, for the grave is no bar to my call. And that's good writing.
Yeah. Oof, that is good writing. Good place to leave it. And we've gone long, I think, anyway, because we didn't really chit chat.
We have gone long because we are awesome and you want to listen to us. But next week, actually, after having gone long for a couple weeks in a row, we actually have a slightly shorter week with a couple of chapters that are not 25 pages on their own. So next week, we're going to be looking at chapter 27, Shelter from the Storm, and chapter 28, Footprints in Air. And we are going to be getting a new perspective. We do not come back to Rand and Matt immediately. So Greg, I'm going to let you do our traditional outro, but what are you looking forward to, or what is one last thought you want to leave us with before we head out?
So I always do my note taking and I finish reading for the chapter. And then before I come down to record, I always write in my notebook the next 2 chapters. And my one thought was writing Shelter from the Storm and Footprints in Air. I was like, this sounds like a great mixtape. Like there's something very poetic about both of those chapters. So it's been great. Like I said, I think this excitement really ratcheted up for me. And you had said that once it gets going, the back half of the book really flies, and I can really feel why this has lasted the test of time so far. So I continue to hope everybody's enjoying listening along. As we move into fall, our lead time is going to get shorter. So we encourage you to please reach out if you have anything you want to say, and anything you want to add to us. We are also at a place where if you are somebody who loves these books, or some chapters coming up are favorites, you could absolutely reach out to us, and we'd love to have a guest on to record and join the conversation, because I still know not that much and Tyler still knows too much. So maybe you'll be somewhere in the middle. So reach out in all the ways that the pre-recorded versions of us will say in just a minute or two. But until then, we will look forward to seeing you through the glass columns. So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tyler Orm and Greg Cass, and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com, or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.